Welcome to Once and Future Podcast, where we examine how the seeds of the past bear fruit in the present. And this is our introductory episode. So I am Liene, and my co-host is
Heather.
We're both excited to be here because some fun facts for you. This is our second time recording this because we're professionals and we did not lose the footage for the first one. That's not why we're doing this again, but it's okay. That was a practice run. We did that on purpose. It's going to be better this time.
Yeah, we're just very busy professionals. We got a lot going on.
That's right. And we meant to do this. Like I said, that was just practice.
That was just practice. Yeah.
So who are we? What is this podcast? What are we doing?
Well, we are looking at the ways that our literary culture has evolved and the ways that past works influence and shape our current works. And I think that mostly we just look at the patterns that we see through different books.
How'd you make it sound so boring?
Well, I think it sounds fascinating.
Oh, okay. I've spotted the issue. So Dr. Heather over there has a PhD, which means she's right about everything except for when we disagree, in which case I'm right. I just use your credentials when it suits my purpose.
Well, yeah, right.
Like,
when you need a credential to bolster your own opinion, you just use mine.
Is that what academia is all about?
Yeah. I mean, yes.
So I have a YouTube channel. That's my credential, a booktube channel. Liene's Library, where I famously have unpopular opinions. So I cannot be trusted at all. Don't have credentials. My one credential is that everyone disagrees with me. So welcome. The name of our podcast comes from the Once and Future King, which is a cheeky little reference because we kind of got started talking about doing this podcast because we were talking so much about how, you know what, everything is King Arthur. Literally everything is King Arthur. And we've come to the conclusion, okay, that not literally everything is King Arthur, but like a lot of things are King Arthur. And we were like, what if we did a podcast to kind of like talk about this? Or we're like, what if we just did a podcast to talk about how like old stories are in the new stories and there's nothing new under the sun, and how you can see these shapes in storytelling and these patterns and how they reference each other back and back and back and back, and just, you know, chat about that. Because as Heather said, that's fun.
It is fun. And I just think, you know, we have these like story patterns. We're not the first people to notice that, right? Like there are books and books.
Dang it, I've been telling people that we
are. Just like the patterns that we see. But I do think it's like just worthwhile seeing the ways that, you know, our contemporary literature is responding to our past. I think it's like, you know, part of media literacy, which like severely lacks these days. So,
well, speaking of that, I was going to say, I think it's also kind of tangentially related and important to talk about how not just how these stories have been told before in different ways and they're popping up again and again, either on purpose or by accident, but also the controversies these are just repeats. Like history just repeats itself in every kind of way. So when we look at what is scandalous in literature, or when we talk about how, like people, like women's brains are rotting because they're reading novels. That's what they said in Jane Austen's day. And that's what they say about the book talk girlies today. So if you think it's so like a new hot take to be saying that, it's actually not. People have been saying this for centuries.
It's kind of like how every generation thinks that they've like invented sex or like some kind of kink. It's like, actually.
But also every generation thinks that, you know, this is the hardest that it's ever been, or it's also the best that it's ever been. And no one understands because it's never been like this before.
It's like, well, actually.
Like certain things, sure, it's never been quite like this before, but it's just reskinned. Like it's been the same core thing before.
Yeah.
And what I put a veneer on it.
And what I think is fun is like seeing the way that these controversies like take shape for every generation too, and the ways that different authors and different cultures are like thinking through different problems. Because obviously, like different generations will come to different conclusions. It's how we like move forward with some ideas. But it's just interesting to see how like every generation is shaping it a little bit differently, and like how our past informs the way that we think. Because I also think a lot of people imagine that like we think in a vacuum, right? That like all of a sudden like we've come up with these ideas, but it's like actually the way that
the genius and his muse.
Right. Like this has been shaped for a long time, that like how we even like experience the world and experience these different mythos and religion, it's been shaped for hundreds of years.
Right. Well, like I said, when we were talking about these stories being the same over again, either on purpose or by accident, even by accident, I mean, it's not just, there's a term for that, right? Where two people invent the same thing at the same time without talking to each other. There's a word
Yes.
for that. But anyway, so it's not that. I mean, it might be that, but it's more just that because you are a citizen of the world, the stories you've been surrounded by did shape you and shaped your
Mhm.
idea of what storytelling even is. Like
Mhm.
just the medium of a book and what we take for granted about what that looks like, what shape it takes, what format it takes, that has all shaped like the neurological pathways in your brain to draw certain conclusions that everyone else has been drawing for the same amount of time because they were shaped by the same things. So even if you're like, oh, I'm not familiar with those stories, so therefore I cannot be referencing them. This is actually just my own creation. Sorry, that's not true. You were shaped by them, even if you didn't realize it. Sorry.
And like now, there is like this whole thing about I think like with the proliferation of like AI and a lot of like book talk books and things, there's this whole thing about like who's copying who with some of these tropes, and people will be like, "Whoa, well, I never even read that book," and I think it shows that it doesn't really even matter if you've read Shakespeare or read King Arthur. They're like in our cultural mythos enough that they are shaping the way that we are writing stories, whether or not it's on purpose. And so I think it's like what we do throughout our podcast is look at the way that it's done purposely and not on purpose, right? Like we'll see things that like, certain authors are, explicitly talking to other stories. And then there are authors who, do it on accident and like we just see it. Um, and so I
Or
think
just
it's
that whole idea of authorship, like
Mhm,
of copywriting and of owning
mhm,
a story form, that gets so complicated these days because you're like, is it plagiarism? Is it copycatting? Just the idea that someone could own like a
mhm,
shape of a narrative is just such a modern idea. So if we're talking about things that are different, that's different. Because
yeah.
back in the day, we didn't have like litigious IP, copyright, whatever, for good and for ill, so there's a
Mhm,
lot of stories that we have attributed authorship to because our best guess is that that's who wrote it, but the idea of the author owning their work, owning their legacy, owning the all material associated with even tangentially to their creative product, like, and where do you draw that line? Because it's much easier if it's, a logo or something because, this
mhm,
image has like pretty strict and I wouldn't say easy, but like relatively easily definable boundaries of what defines this logo and how far you have to deviate from it in order to be something different that's not infringing on copyright. But books and book series, there's so
mhm,
much in them. And where do you draw that line? Is it the name of a
mhm.
character? Okay, well, but like what if the name is like Paul? These aren't, you don't own that name. Or like, what if it's the concept of little boy wizard goes to school? Like,
Yeah.
there's a lot of authors that have done that. Who does someone own that concept? So like,
Mhm,
what is it to own a story? And in that sense, again, for good and for ill, like, the idea that you should have ownership over what you've created. On the one hand, that is good for the artist to not be taken advantage of, but on the other hand, it takes out the community aspect of storytelling that existed for a much larger part of human history, where stories were told, stories, it was oral tradition. The Grimm's brothers get credit, but they didn't write those stories. These
mhm,
stories were collectively created and retold, and they have now been sort of trapped in amber in this final form, the way the Grimm's brothers wrote them down. But you guaranteed that the 50,000 grandmothers that told those stories, they all put their little spin on it, replaced the name with their grandbaby,
mhm.
threw in that bird that they made up because the kids liked it. Like there were 50,000 versions of these stories. And for someone to say that, oh, that's not the canonically correct Snow White, the very idea of there being a canonically correct folk tale when the folk are the ones telling it
Yeah.
however they please. Same with like food, when you're like, oh, this isn't authentic cuisine. It's like, well, we've decided to put like a boundary on this, but people were just making the food that was available to them with the ingredients that were available to them in a way that would taste decent and the way that their mothers and grandmothers did it because like if it ain't broke don't fix it, so they found a way to make this taste good, let's do it like that too. But I don't have this ingredient, so I'm not going to use it because it's there was a plague that wiped it out in my town. And you can't be like, oh, you're not making authentic curry, even though, it's like, well, we're just making food.
Right. And I think like a lot of things that we think are canon are actually fan fiction. Like just like written down, like you said, like they've been put in amber, like the Grimm's brothers. But even going back to King Arthur, like all of those original stories were just pulled from hundreds of different authors. And then Mallory, an English author, decided to write it down and like collate
The
it.
true
And
history
then,
of the real
T.H.
person.
White. Hmm?
The
What?
true history of the real person, King Arthur.
Right. And then like T.H. White then created the story and then his book inspired the Sword of the Stone. And so we have this idea of like what's canon when all of these stories were more or less like fan fiction of this plethora of stories that came before. And so it's like, how do you even pin down what's canon when like what came before it was so like ever changing as well? Like the original King Arthur's, I mean, and you can't even really, it's hard to even say like the original, right? Because again, like we got Mallory's version from this like hundreds of other poems and stories. There's different versions of what happened to him, and if you try to collate all of those kinds of stuff, you're not going to get like a linear progression. And so that's what they've tried to do. Like that's what the Grimm's brothers were doing, right? They're trying to like set a story into place so that it's something that's like becomes a cultural touchstone more easily, right? Because then
I
everyone's
wouldn't even say that
referencing
they
the
were
same
trying to.
story.
I don't think the Grimm's brothers were trying to make it a cultural touchstone. Like,
Oh, right,
I
right,
mean,
right.
for good and for ill, like
Yeah,
this
that's
type
what
of
happens.
copyright law, that like it's a good thing to be able to kind of like put your stamp on something and say, hey, you're stealing. Like there is this is something very positive about that. But again, so like the Grimm's brothers, they were just, hey, there's so many stories are going to get lost if it's just
Mhm,
grandmas telling them around the fire to their kids. So if we don't write this down, this will get forgotten. And they're right, it would have been. So they performed a very important service by just getting down a version of these stories, which was the point of it. And there's examples of that in a lot of languages and cultures where someone did
yeah,
that. Someone's famous in that country for doing the Grimm's brothers thing, where like let's write this down before we lose it.
like Homer.
Same,
We don't
same
even
with
know if like
recipes. Like let's write down recipes before we lose them.
yeah,
So the Grimm's brothers, I don't think, not having known them personally, I don't think they were seeking personal glory and to get credit for these stories, to be
yeah,
like, these are our stories. But everyone says these are the Grimm's fairy tales, as if they
right,
own them, as if they wrote them. And they wrote them down. They
yeah,
didn't write them. And I think that's, again, where people want to be able to point to a thing and be like, this is correct. Like, I've checked the Wikipedia page. This is canon. This is
mhm,
correct. This is whatever. And again, for good and for ill. So like being able to pin that down more specifically if you want to have a deep lore debate about the intricacies of some complex blah 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 blah, sure. But again, then you lose that malleability. And that's where in the modern day, fan fiction is not a new thing. Fan
yeah,
fiction is literally what storytelling was. Like everybody was taking a story and being like, "Oh, well, I want to tell it like this, or I want to insert this, or the kids
mhm.
only want to hear this one part of it, so let me embellish that for them, or whatever." So
My
because
favorite piece of oh,
I was gonna
sorry, go
say,
ahead.
because we've like codified things and put boxes around it, then the human desire to do this had to go somewhere, and so it had to
Mhm,
kind of go under the table and be fan fiction. But it's the same thing we've always been doing.
mhm. Like, my favorite piece of fan fiction is Paradise Lost, which is, like, fan fiction of the Bible, and, like, it's interesting because Paradise Lost is what people think of when they think of the creation story, and they think of, like, our modern version of Satan comes from Paradise Lost more than it comes from the Bible, and I think that Milton was trying to create a cultural touchstone, like, with his work, right? And same with Mallory, when he set down, his version of the King Arthur story, he was trying to tell a specific story of Arthur that like bolstered the English tradition of Arthur because so many of those authors were French. And so he was creating an English story and that was like his specific project.
Well,
So
I mean, this is something that we talk about in our podcast too, is how if you trace the shape of a story over time, what you'll find is that the shape of the story changes very little, but in how it's colored in, that tells you a lot about the person who was doing the
mhm,
telling and the people they were telling it to and why, and like the
mhm,
times, like what they were responding to in the
mhm,
current moment in history. So I mean, like if you trace King Arthur, obviously, like the motivations of people who are wanting to pin down King Arthur in a specific kind of way for specific
mhm.
reasons. But like with vampire stories, obviously that comes up
Yeah.
a lot. It's like what is a vampire? Like, I mean, I'm not gonna say it
Mhm,
doesn't change at all, but like this sort of like the essentials of that in order to be recognizable as a vampire. There's some pretty basic things there, like that people recognize at like the Spirit Halloween store. Like that's vampire.
right.
But like what we want to do with that, if you trace it over time, it actually is, like a mirror reflecting what was going on with society, what was going on politically, the
Mhm,
fears and interests of the people that were telling it and they were being told to.
mhm. Yeah. That's what I think is interesting, the way, 'cause I mean, 'cause, like, we're still telling stories about King Arthur and Guinevere, so there is something about this, like, the sequence of events that are still interesting to people, but, like, how they, the motivations for those people end up being different, the motivations for the characters, and so it is interesting to, like, see how, like, what the kind of motivations that people are focusing on, or, like, the pieces of the story that they take that they find really interesting.
Plus, name recognition. We're all about that
Yeah.
these King Arthur rebooted.
And I mean, you could say the same thing about Shakespeare, right? Like, Shakespeare, most of his works were not, quote unquote original, right? Like, he's getting stuff from Italian works, he's getting stuff from the histories, like he's pulling what's available to him in his
Let me
culture,
just
and
stop you
then
right there and say, how dare you?
and then again, like, then we think about the Shakespeare canon, right? In one of our episodes, we talk about the idea of Shakespeare and, like, what he has meant culturally, just like the idea of him, not necessarily even his works. But I mean, you trace his, like, then he, so he takes those other stories and the way that we reshape them over time. And then what I think what is even more fascinating about plays is that every time it's being put on stage, you could say the same thing about author and audience, right? But this time it's the director, producer, and what they want to say with his work, but they're still using his work. They just want to say something a little bit different.
Or they're setting it in the jungle and adding Elton John music and making that all about animals.
Or, we just saw Hamlet in LA. What was that director? I forget his name.
His name I
O'Hara?
don't remember.
Robert O'Hara, I think
That
his
sounds
name was.
right.
And he had a, film noir Hamlet that then, like, became a modern commentary on, like, the shape of Hamlet
A
itself, and
meta commentary.
a meta commentary. And so again, like, we're still using these stories to reflect on what's happening in our current time. So I think that there is this, like, huge anti-intellectual movement in our country right now to kind of disregard our history and our historical texts, and, like, even our literary texts. But so much of
Well,
this of
and
now is shaped by what we.
I think there's partly the reason why people would feel like they want to push back on the idea that, oh, you're just telling the same stories over again, even if you don't realize it, because people want to think that they have creativity and invention and they've invented this idea. So I mean, I
We're
get that.
special boys.
But I mean, I think that loses the actually really, really positive thing that is that if you share this language of a story that we all know, then you can use that language to say whatever you want to say. And so
Mhm.
it's because Hamlet is so well known, has been so well known for so long, that you don't have to go through the introduction, explanation, let's learn to
Mhm.
speak this language part of it. The assumption is we all speak Hamlet. So
Mhm.
let's using the speech of Hamlet, let's have a conversation that we want to have. And so
Mhm.
to look at it as a bad thing or something, I think is a mistake. It's a valuable tool, this
Right.
lexicon of stories that we all vaguely at least have some idea of, even if not all the specifics. This is a rich sort of tapestry from which we can weave new stories.
And I think, like, even if you don't have that language, right? Like, maybe you don't know Hamlet, like, maybe you're part of, a place, or, you live somewhere that's not accessible to you. And, like, I think there are, like, a lot of people who don't know where our stories come from, and they're encountering something for the first time. I think it enriches the story to know that there is, a history behind what they're reading. So I think on the one hand, like, yes, we're talking about, the ways that these things are in our culture and that we can see them and they provide this common language. But I think for those who don't understand that there is a common language, I think that's also what this podcast is about. Is, like, teaching the ways that we can
Well, yeah, I
see
mean,
these
like I was
things.
saying in the very beginning about how, like, just the what we think of as a book, like
Yeah.
what's necessary and required for to be recognizable as the form of a book. Like,
Mhm.
just even down to how the title page looks and how the fact that you have chapters, the fact that it's, like this text on paper and that you read it, from like the direction in which you read it and like what how this is all supposed to go. Like that all we take for granted. Well, that's just a book. But there's so many reasons behind why that's what
Why?
it is. And there's so many things within the story that again, you're just like, well, that's just a 3 act, story. Like that's just like that's how storytelling is. It's like, okay,
Right.
but that didn't come out of nowhere. And there's
Yeah.
so many more specific things too. It's like so many tropes, so many narrative devices, so many things that have been sort of like workshopped for so long. And these are the, this is the cream of the crop that has stood the test of time, that we've kind of refined this process over decades, centuries, millennia, telling stories over and over. And the ones that were good, the ones that people kept wanting to hear, are the ones that stuck around, or then got kind of like retooled and reshaped because they're like, oh, this is good stuff, but I gotta like tune it up for my current audience. So we've gotten very good at figuring out what humans like to hear. And I think to kind of like take that for granted, or to not even realize like the shoulders that you are standing upon in just the basics of what is storytelling. You're doing yourself a disservice to not realize that, and to then be able to play off of that.
And I think like, stories, they stand the test of time because, they resonate with people, but also like the powers that be, the, governments and things like that have also chosen the kinds
They
of
resonated with the powers that be.
yeah, they resonate with the powers that be. Like if we think about Shakespeare was more or less invented by the generation that came after him. Like, yes, he was super popular in his time, but there was a concerted effort to keep him popular because it was part of a cultural project, right? England wanted that's what like national poets end up doing, right? They're trying to codify like what is English, what is
Oh yeah, the book talk
American.
girlies, they're all about the national poets.
Yeah. But, so I think like if we're taking like, Shakespeare as a touchstone for these kinds of ideas, like he was made on purpose, and he's become almost, we talk about this in another episode, but like he becomes this kind of almost religious figure like within our,
I was gonna say, like, would you just want to redo the Shakespeare episode while we're on it?
yeah. So stay tuned for that episode if you want to know more of our thoughts on that. But I mean, you could say the same about like religious texts. I don't want to get us in trouble in our first episode, but I mean, again, going back to Paradise Lost, like, again, he's trying to like keep a version of events, a version of a story, because the powers that be, the government powers, the powers who are in power, like they want to tell a certain version of the story, and they want to make sure that story survives.
I mean, like American children growing up, they all knew about George Washington and the cherry tree. I was like,
Yeah.
I'm about American. I was gonna say apple tree, but it's like, no, cherry tree.
That
George
story
Washington.
that everybody knows.
I know it. The cherry tree, and also Abraham Lincoln and the penny. Like, and these have become mythic stories about like the mythos of our own country. And people want to mythologize their origins. We do it all the time. And that's not new. America's a very new country, and we've done it already. So
And I think this is why people are afraid of looking at too much history, or because they don't want, if you look at the context that a myth is created in, it then disrupts the myth, right? Again, you could say that about Shakespeare, right? Like if you look at the context in which he was writing.
we did a Shakespeare episode, Heather.
I just think it's a good touchdown. But I think that just goes in general, right? Like if you look at, a big, an important story, and then look at the context within and it's written, it disrupts the mythos a little bit. So I do think that there is kind of this fear or this
looking under the hood.
This backlash against it about like not looking into our histories too much.
You don't want to see how the sausage is made.
Exactly. But we need to, because it like tells us more about the way that we are thinking. I mean, that's why I got a PhD in literature in the first place, because
you're boring.
because I really believe that the stories that we tell are so important to like how we come to think about things. Like it's absolutely vital to understand ourselves and our history.
As important as STEM is, humanities are also important. Because, the STEM will get us to, the practicalities of life, but human beings need to narrativize and need to understand, metaphysically their place in the world.
Yeah.
And you can only do that through literature and the arts.
Right. No matter like the tech bros who, I don't know, who like to think that they can rationalize, quote unquote, rationalize things. And that's like, the height of human thought. Like history has shown
humanities will teach you.
Not true. The humanities will
I was gonna say the humanities will teach you that if you think that you're being purely rational, you're wrong. And
Yeah.
it's because you didn't take your humanities classes that you're operating under the delusion that you're entirely rational.
Or even like just like the history of science. It's like, do you know what people thought was rational 200 years ago? Like before we figured out germ theory, do you know the kinds of things people thought, based on quote unquote science and rationality? So I think it's just vital that we look at like not just and like even our like why we uphold rationality, right? Like as if like that is something to be achieved and that's like something higher than emotion. Even that can be traced through the ways that we, tell stories and things like that and the people that we like to make heroes.
Yeah, and I mean there is a sort of dialectical relationship between people who are telling stories and people who are receiving stories because it shapes how you think, and because it's shaped how you think, then you have become an audience that thinks a kind of way, and so then that shapes the kind of material that's written for that audience, and it's a feedback loop. And so it is not insignificant to look at what is being told and what is resonating for good and for ill. So it's going to tell you a lot about how a populace is thinking, but it's not only that like people just think a kind of way and we're going to observe how people think by what they respond to, because how they think has been shaped by what has been given to them. And it's not nothing, it's a chicken or the egg problem. So it is an ongoing and conversation where people are continually being shaped by what they consume, and this idea that you have to find out what people like and then make that. People don't know what they like until they see it. So yeah, there's some of like, this is what people have been liking, but people only started liking that when it was presented to them as an option. They started to get used to that being a thing that could be. So
And like even if like you don't read, I mean, again, like this is the thing with movies too. Like why you like I remember one time my one of my professors she was a professor in like an expert in Arthurian literature. She was once asked like why the humanities were important, and she was like, "Have you seen a movie?" Like, I mean, it's not even just about the books that we read and like the text that we read. It's also about like just media in general, about the kinds of trends that we see out there and the movies that we watch. I mean, where do you think all those movies came from? Like those are stories and they're taking the shape of things that have come before, and they're looking at certain trends and cultural mythos. Like just looking at, something like the Marvel canon. I mean, people think of it, oh, it's like silly little movies about superheroes, but it's like, where do you think our
no, they're
ideas of
silly big
heroes?
movies, Heather. Those are not
A
little
blockbuster
movies.
can't tell us anything about like, our culture. But like where do you think the idea of these heroes have come from? Like where do you think these like mythos have come from about like
Well,
what
but I
we
mean, even that, like, I mean, we've talked about how the thing isn't necessarily the thing in its own time. And
Mhm.
the movies that were made fun of or panned by critics 20, 30, 40, 50, 60,
Mhm.
70, I'll just say all the numbers years ago, then all those decades later, they become classics. They were not understood in their time. We look back, this is when movies were good. Yeah, but at the time, people didn't think movies were good. They thought they were getting crap. And only later, in retrospect, they're like, no, no, that was when movies were good, because
Yeah.
now we think that those are good movies, but they didn't think they were good at the time. So like the movies from the present day, like there is no doubt in my mind, not every single movie obviously, but a lot of movies that get panned now, in 20, 30, 40 years are going to be like, it was not understood in its time, it is actually genius of cinema, blah blah blah.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, as a culture too, we like to retrospect things as well.
Well, it's
Like
also, and this is, you can observe this in the microcosm of Star Wars, is that the
mm,
people that were shaped by this were too young to say anything about it in its own time. And then they grew up, and it's about 30 years later that suddenly they're like, no, it was not understood in its time, but it's actually a masterpiece, because they were a kid when that happened and it
right.
affected them at a formative time. And now they're old enough and influential enough to be like, no, I'll have my say. And that actually was brilliant. And you observed this with the Star Wars prequels. And when they came out, the adults who had the microphone were like, this is garbage. But the children who ate that shit up, they grew up and were like, actually, it was not appreciated in its time, and they're amazing and brilliant. This is
Are
like
you speaking from like a personal feeling?
right, yes, for sure. But I mean, again, like, so like people like specifically will say that about Star Wars.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know why people stop there. Like, why do you think movies like 30 years later that weren't that popular or that well regarded at their time are suddenly considered Criterion classics that, need to have 50,000 special editions and we're going to write essays about them. It's the same thing.
Yeah. And I think like there is a kind of tendency in our culture, and I think it has to do with like how individualistic America is, and like capitalism that tells you that you have to be super special to be, you have to be like unique. Like there is this, myth about like having genius, right? That you can only be good if it's genius. And I think that's like to the detriment of like how we are a communal like species. And I think by acting like, individualism is like what's important, and uniqueness and genius or whatever, take this out of the context of our communities, and that's what like makes our species interesting. And I think like because of that, if something's too popular, right, then all of a sudden it becomes uncool. And that doesn't mean that we can't criticize popular things. We absolutely should look at things with a critical eye, but like just because something is popular doesn't mean that it's like bad. Like, again, Shakespeare was popular in his time. He was the pop culture of his time.
And it was only later, 30 years later.
Yeah. It was only when he became part of this like project of what English is, and like this English like capital L literature.
Like we said earlier, like women were, told that their brains are rotting from reading novels. And now those novels are required reading in English class.
Yeah.
Because this is true literature.
Yeah. Like
Jane I can't wait for 100 years from now when Colleen Hoover is taught in English class as true literature. She is the Emily Bronte of our day. And I wish people would recognize.
Colleen Hoover. I can't get past that joke.
Did we tell her joke? I've actually never read a Colleen Hoover book, and that's okay by me. But I mean, I hear she's great.
Listen, I read filthy stuff, but so I don't. I listen and I don't judge. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting, right? Like thinking about what is going to stand the test of time. Like what of those, like which of those books is going? Like thinking about like back to when the Hunger Games was a big thing. There was 1,000. Books that came out that were about dystopian, and then like the Hunger Games,
the most sincere form of flattery.
And then, but the Hunger Games is the one that sticks out the most, right? Thinking about Harry Potter too. I mean, there's lots of stories about that, but like the ones that kind of stick out to us, and it doesn't necessarily mean like they're like the best and most perfect, right? But
there were a lot of Twilight copycats too.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, what about those stories are sticking out to people, and like the thing that they hold on to? Like Twilight still has, it's still read, right? And again, not the most, best written, and not the, the most perfect story, but it is something that
a lot of classic literature, is not the best written.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Dickens, too many words. You didn't need all those words.
Well, when you're getting paid by the word, you would also.
Again, for good and for ill, we've changed a lot of things about how we do this.
But I mean, he was loved in his time. People were obsessed with him. I mean, people
still are.
And still are. But it's like, they used to, obviously before planes and like computers in America, they would have to like wait for the boats to come, right? To like bring over the next, like, because Dickens was serialized, people got things a couple chapters at a time instead of a whole book, because he made more money that way.
It's like fan fiction.
Right. People would be waiting on the docks for his books to like.
And what the problem with fan fiction that gets published is that it's really long, because it was written a chapter at a time and published a chapter at a time, and then we just bound it up like Great Expectations.
But this was like 150 years ago, and people were like waiting on the docks.
I'm saying that after is the Great Expectations of its time.
Yeah.
Just like Colleen.
That's exactly what I thought when I saw the movie. Oh, I didn't even watch the movie. I watched a compilation of the movie.
I have not seen the movie or read the book
on YouTube. Yeah, but I do think it's interesting, like how like we've always had a fan culture. Like, I mean, people have always, again, because we're a communal species, we like to like things together, right? Like, even if you think that you have,
not to get political, capitalism is very antithetical to how humans are wired.
Right, exactly. exactly. And I think it's convincing us that things need to be super special and unique in order to be good, but then forget again that like we are a communal species. We like to like things together and we like stories. I mean, there are people who only read a certain genre because they like the shape of that story, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I think that that's just part of us. And like we've always had, I mean, people were fans of Shakespeare, people were fans of Sophocles or whatever, I'm sure.
I did just think of the fox that eats jelly beans in Red Rising when you said that. I was like, yeah, hell yeah, I'm a big fan of Sophocles. Oh, right.
So again, like I think that because of consumerism, I mean, there is a criticism to be had about like the ways, fandoms operate now. But I mean, I think fandom is very natural for, our species. So,
Yeah, well then like with filmmaking, the idea of the auteur director is
mm,
insane. Like with a book, there's a better case to be made that this is like, a person and their pen and they solo created this. Like, okay, they created it based on the building blocks of the context and do you think you fell out of a coconut tree? Like stand on the shoulders of giants. But the directors of films, like films art, it takes a village.
yeah,
And certainly the director is not to diminish the work of a director and what it takes to be good and talented in that job, but they are not doing this by themselves. And so
right.
the way that they get like this is their movie is I mean, I understand why that happens because you can't name every person that's getting, named in the credits. But just all right, that we need to think of it as like
Yeah.
attributing it to a person. Like, I mean, I would say I love Guy Ritchie movies, I love Christopher Nolan movies, and I would say it that way. But Christopher Nolan, and he did not make those movies by himself. He could
No.
not have made those movies by himself. And so I
They're just
remember
as much like Cillian Murphy's movies.
Killian.
Oh, that's right. I always say it wrong.
That's why we're getting canceled. It's because you said Killian Murphy's name wrong.
But you know what? Good thing I have you here to always correct me when I mispronounce things.
I told you you're always right except for when I'm right.
Um,
But like I was watching one of those actors on actors I guess interview type things. I've never
mhm.
actually watched one of those before. This is the only one that I've seen. It was Diego Luna talking to Hayden Christensen, and Diego Luna, like for anyone that doesn't know who Diego Luna is in Andor and in Rogue One. And he was talking about how because he got to be for Andor, and obviously he's the lead actor, he plays Cassian Andor, but he's a producer and he's involved with like the script writing. And because he got to like wear so many hats, then he got to be involved in the process. And he was talking like specifically about how beneficial this was to him as an actor and how he
Mhm,
wanted to pay that forward to the actors he was around because then they were on set with somebody who could also share with them the context that he knows
mhm,
because he didn't just show up to set and be like where do I stand, what do I say. He knows why the set looks like it does because he was involved in the decision to make
mhm,
it look like that. He knows why they're filming it in this order because he was involved in the decision to film it in this order. And the fact that that makes his performance better because he's part of the community that's putting this together. He's not just doing his piece of it. He's not just, I'm the actor, I've shown up, where do I stand? What, like Ben Affleck's character in Shakespeare in Love is a, what is the play and what is my part? Like, we're doing this together. And
yeah,
so then Diego Luna could also, for the other actors who didn't have the benefit of that because they weren't, executive producer on it, they don't know why the set looks like it does. They don't know why the script is like it is, but he does. So he can say like, I'm, your resource. Like I'll share with you what I know.
mhm,
I can tell you why this is happening so that we can all, and that's what a good director also does is, helps to bring in the community to be involved in this in a way. And this is, not to get completely derailed, but like the whole idea that studios are like, you only need the writers to write the thing and then leave because
right.
they did their piece of it because that's just not how this works.
Yeah, and I think that you can really tell the difference in the quality of something, like, that's why Andor is so quality, it's not just, like, a random idea and, like, "Oh, well, this is a pretty little set, and this is, like, the story that we wrote." I mean, there's, like, something to Andor that there's, like, a you can feel it when you're watching that show, that there's, like, a deeper understanding of, like, the world and the context and the story they're telling,
Well,
like, you
that
can
they care
feel it,
in every
that they
aspect.
care, and that because I think that there's so many people who don't, like, the ones who wanna see, like, these isolated pieces of something, there's just something that falls flat in that kind of storytelling, so I think it's, like it's to our detriment when we try to isolate jobs, right? It's like so much better. And like as a viewer, you just enjoy it more when there's like that kind of storytelling, that kind of attention, that kind of care paid to like the world that you're inhabiting, especially something like Star Wars that has this like
Well,
huge.
and to bring it back to sort of the original once and future topic of it all, I think when you are an author writing or even a reader reading, those are again more arguably solitary
Mhm,
individual activities. And I think because we are a species, as you say, and as I said, and as we've proven now with our great evidence, a social and communal species, it can be isolating.
mhm.
It's like, oh, this solo thing that you and you alone with your pen, you and you alone with your book. But I think by looking at the history of storytelling and the history of the shape of stories that we are drawn to, then even when you are quote unquote alone with the pen, alone with the book, you you feel that sense of community because you know the greater context in which where this sits
Mhm,
and what you are participating in being again a collective thing
mhm.
that even in even in the moment you're alone, that it's not actually such a solitary activity. It's not in a vacuum. You are part
Well,
of a community of writers and readers.
and, it's a recent idea that it is a solitary activity, right? Because, really only the last 150 years or so, because before then, not everybody in the family could read,
I
or
mean,
it
before
was.
then just reading and writing just didn't exist.
Yeah, well, like, yeah. So, like, those kinds of stories were just, like, told orally. But then even when they started to be written down, like, if your family got a novel, like, someone would sit and read it out loud. Like, very rarely.
But audiobooks aren't reading, Heather.
Like, again, like Dickens, I mean, he would perform his books for people, right? He was famous for that. He would read them aloud to audiences because people liked that was, like, part of how people experience novels until fairly recently when it has become this very individual experience, but they were read aloud as, like, that's what you did. You didn't have TVs, so it's
Well,
like you'd sit
and
around as a family and read out loud.
obviously, like, the convenience of it is a factor for sure, but I
Yeah.
think the reason audiobooks are so popular isn't just convenience,
Yes,
because, like, a
100%.
Kindle app is almost equally as convenient, maybe not, because
Mhm.
again, like, you can do something else with your hands, you don't have to be looking at something, so, again, audiobooks are extremely convenient, no argument there, but you are hearing another human voice, like, it doesn't
Mhm.
feel so alone, it feels like that more we're, wired for, like, the oral tradition, and it
Mhm.
is the modern iteration of the oral tradition.
Mhm. And it becomes this. I think, like, again, like, not just the oral tradition part too, but then, like, you are hearing somebody else's, like, version of it too, kind of is like, you're experiencing it together, which I guess is basically restating what you just said. But I think that there
Thank
is
you
just
for that,
something to that kind of performance that, again, we like, and I think that it can help us see the story in a different way and experience it. Like, I get a lot of people. I'm sure you experience this too, but people are like, "You probably aren't even, like, getting all the story because you're listening into it too fast," or like, "How can you
people would never dare speak to me like that.
process process it that way?" And it's like, because I can't. Like, we are wired to do this. Like, we
It's
are.
actually so I was actually gonna say this, that, consuming something orally is much easier, and not again not in the convenience sense, in the sense of it is less steps removed from what you are
Mhm,
trying to understand, because
mhm,
words themselves are like when you're speaking to each other, they are like it's a referent, it's a symbol
mhm,
of a thing that you're trying to say. So by using words, we're indicating another thing that you're meant to imagine by what we've agreed to these sounds mean. That when you read a book, now we have to take these symbols, turn them into the sounds that we know that mean something, and then those sounds have to turn into the images and meanings. So that's
mhm.
3 times removed now. So reading a physical book is more difficult, just like it just is, because
Yeah,
it's more steps removed from what you are trying to understand.
yeah. But, like, and I like that when you have these productions too of audiobooks and then you get the emphasis on certain words, right? Because, like, obviously as an author when
It's
you're
pronounced
writing.
emphasis.
Hmm? What'd you say?
I said it's pronounced emphasis.
Um, my thought is derailed. I think that, then you again, like in audiobooks, you can get a sense of what the emphasis was too for the author, and then or even
Well,
like
you get what the
narrator.
audiobook narrator thought anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it depends on like how closely everyone was involved in that, but
I mean, sometimes the author's dead, so
yeah. And there are like some books where I'll go, I need to read this with my eyeballs because I want to like have like my own interaction with it.
narrator
Um,
sucks.
yeah. My brain is like completely derailed.
Of the emphasis.
Yeah.
Wow. Didn't know I had this power. But yeah. So in short, nothing new exists. We're all just copies of copies of copies. Be humbler and
Yeah.
know your place. That's what this podcast is about. Humbling everyone.
You're not that special.
I'm telling everyone that you are not special, but also that Colleen Hoover is the Emily Bronte of her day. So we're elevating and deflating, and
I mean, honestly, it ends with us is kind of like Wuthering Heights, but I mean, you could probably make that case.
Emily Bronte is toxic as hell, but it's a classic. No,
it's a classic, so the toxicity is okay.
Yeah. And I think Nicholas Sparks is the Thomas Hardy of his day.
I'm sorry. Okay, so I've read. I was just like in my head. I was then comparing the
You're only
Notebook.
laughing because you know I'm right about all of it.
Well, I was comparing like the Notebook with oh God, what's that book? Thomas Hardy. The one with like where like he hangs all the children.
Spoilers.
It was like a very, very traumatic book for me, which is probably why I but I guess like Nicholas Sparks is very like emotionally manipulative in his books, trauma porn. And like Thomas Hardy is like very much like a trauma porn book. Like
I wasn't joking. I don't know why you're laughing about any of these.
Like Thomas Hardy, I remember when I read Jude the Obscure. That's the book I was thinking of.
Yeah.
After I finished that, I was like, Thomas Hardy, do you need a hug? Do you need therapy? Because that was traumatizing for me. They all need therapy. So does Nicholas Sparks. I mean, I guess, never mind. That's a spoiler for the Notebook in case anybody has
So you're
read
fine
it
with spoiling Jude the Obscure, but not with spoiling the Notebook.
I have a feeling that
Nicholas Sparks is the greater.
Less people will read Jude the Obscure. It is that is a hard book to get through.
Is it obscure?
Is
it obscure?
It's traumatizing. There's so much, like, it's so fucked up. I don't even know. I was like, when was this book written? Thomas Hardy was like also obsessed with his wife, and we
love to see it.
When he died, he had his heart like buried with his wife's heart. He was very romantic.
Okay.
At least I hope that's how the story goes. I'm pretty sure. At least that's what I remember from my my
very
school days.
Heathcliff of him to do that.
He was very, very Heathcliff. He was very extra.
All right.
So on that note,
I hope we've covered everything important.
I hope we've convinced you to keep listening. You'll have, many more nuggets of Colleen Hoover and
so many more truths that if you're not listening to this podcast, it's because you're afraid of the truth.
Right.
Or you're afraid that old novels are going to get spoiled.
I feel like this introduction is way more unserious than our original introduction. I feel like I was very serious in our first.
You were, and that's okay. I told you not to be. So that was practice.
I know, exactly. So this is great that we redid it.
Like I said, we did it on purpose.
We did it on purpose. Yeah. We're now seasoned podcasters.
Exactly. So how fate intended.
So keep listening to our show and learn more about.
Probably skip the Shakespeare episode because you basically already got the cliff notes of that one.
No. Don't listen to that one. Take notes.
Sorry, did I give you an aneurysm by suggesting someone skip the Shakespeare episode?
Yeah.
Deep
More
breath,
to come. More to come.
All right. Well, on that note, we'll see you in the next equally well-organized Chit Chat. Bye.